This is the final mod in the oil pressure experiments. What we're going to do here is install a control orifice that will directly control the amount of oil that goes to the crankshaft. This modification is going to involve some changes to the oil cap and to the cavity where the oil filter goes. Let's briefly review once again how the oil moves around in the clutch cover. On this side you can see this port right here, and this is the port that is connected to the oil pump, and oil comes through here and then moves up through this channel and comes out right there in the oil filter cavity. At that point, with the oil coming at pressure through this galley, it has to find its way around the little gap in the oil filter here in the cavity and get itself into the filter. Once the oil reaches the media, it passes through the filter and goes through these two holes that are in the bypass valve, and from there it enters into the cap and it comes out through these two holes, one of which feeds the crankshaft and the other feeds the rest of the engine. Once the oil is coming through the cap, it goes down this port, and the crankshaft is on the other side right here. There's also a port up here that feeds the remainder of the engine. What we wanted to do was take a small 1/16 NPT plug like this, put a control orifice in it, and put that control orifice here in the cap at the port that feeds the crank. The problem with that is that if you look inside the clutch cover, you'll note that while this is where the oil comes out, and oil will take the path of least resistance and most of it will go through the filter, there's a pathway here so that there could be some leakage that goes down to the crank. So you don't know at that point if your control orifice is doing the job or if there's some leakage that is giving you more oil to the crankshaft than you think you should be getting. And we needed to come up with a different idea. When I was visiting with Paul, we sat around for some time with a cap like this in our hands talking about what could be done. And Paul told me that there are some Kawasaki engines that have an O-ring here and an O-ring on this side to seal this off. We talked about some way to modify this cap so that we could seal this port from the inlet port, and basically came to the conclusion that not only because this is in the way, this is the cutout that the oil port skirts, but there really wasn't enough material here to install another O-ring, plus you'd have to have some rather complicated machining operation to skirt or go around this cutout. It just wasn't really going to work, and there's no way to modify any other Kawasaki cap. So the solution that Paul ultimately came up with was first to take some Devcon or JB weld and dam up this notch, essentially filling it in with JB weld, and then taking this port and relocating it inside of the filter cavity. So what we're going to do is first modify the cap and then block this port off and fill it so that it is completely full, and then we're going to install an O-ring right here as well as the O-ring that seals right here. What that will do for us is have the oil come into the filter inside the cavity, which is a much better, from a flow perspective, way to get oil into the filter. And it's also going to seal not only the crank port but the engine port, so that there can't be any unfiltered oil or leakage going past along this path and along the circumference here. Kawasaki's relying on the relatively close fit to prevent that from happening, but since we're trying to meter oil, we really need to have a much tighter solution. So that's what we're going to do here. Once we've got that modification done, it becomes a matter of personal preference as to whether or not you drill and tap this port and install the control orifice there, or easier, if you drill and tap the cap and put the control orifice in the cap itself. This line in here that I've drawn is a line that is pretty much between the opening of the pressure relief valve port and the oil inlet port on the front of the oil filter cavity. If you look at the cover here, you can see there's a lot of material right in this area. What we need to do is drill a hole that is at a rather high angle and have it start right about where I put that cross line and come through the roof of that port. With the oil inlet port blocked off, then what we'll have is a port right in here that puts oil right into the oil filter, and that will allow us, as I said, to seal off the front and install our control valve. In order to do this, I'm going to have to take a Dremel tool and cut a scarf in there that I can start a drill bit into, and then with appropriate size scarf in there, I'll be able to drill straight through. It's not that tricky an operation. There's a little bit of a pucker factor involved, but as I said, there's a lot of material in there, and the absolute angle is not entirely critical. The only thing that is critical is that you stay on this line and keep the hole at a relatively high angle. I've gone ahead and installed a piece of brass all thread that goes all the way up to just above the top of the port, and then laid in masking tape and filled the hole, and then topped it off with some masking tape to form the plug for the existing hole. Now I'll remove the masking tape so you can see the result. And there's the filled hole. There's just a little bit of polishing required to finish it off, and then I'll be ready to drill a new port. There is the finished hole. And the way this will work is with the filter in place, we'll install an O-ring that will seal on that shoulder and on the face of the filter. And then the cap, of course, it will have an O-ring mounted on it, and it's got this mod to it. So this cap will go on and seal everything just the way we need it to. There is the finished hole. And you probably can't see it, but I've radiused the hole, and I've also wallowed out or made a small well in an area about this big around the hole, and that will help the oil move into the filter media. I have a drill rod stuck through the hole so that you can see where that hole comes out. It comes out just about right into the galley that comes up from the oil pump. To finish this off, I'm going to drill and tap this port here to accept this control orifice, and because the space is so tight, I've got my tap inserted into a 1/4 inch extension, and the tap handle has got the 1/4 inch extension attached to it. The first thing I'm going to do is I've made this little counterbore tool. It's got a pilot on the end, and I will just make a little bit of a counterbore into that port, probably, I don't know, 1/16 of an inch deep or so. It is easier to tap the port here on the cap, the port that leads down to the crank, and there's no real reason why you can't do that. It's just my preference to put it in the port that goes in the case down to the crank. The tapping operation is complete, and I've installed the plug into the case. Again, that control orifice is a 1/16 NPT pipe plug, and it has a number 43 hole drilled in it as a control orifice. The tapping operation is not difficult. The hole as it exists in the case is just about the right size for the tap. It is at an angle though, and although it's not necessary if you've got a steady hand, I went ahead and made myself a counterbore tool and put a counterbore in there that's about a 1/16 of an inch deep, and that gives a square surface for the tap to grab onto and makes tapping a little bit easier. Well, there it is. It's all done. We've got the original oil galley blocked off and a new oil galley here in the filter cavity, and the oil will come from the oil pump, pass through the filter. We will have an O-ring here at the front that is sealing against this edge, against this land right here, and against the face of the filter, and that will prevent any unfiltered oil and bypass oil from crossing this path. As it comes through the cap, it will go down and control the amount of oil that goes to the crankshaft, and this, coupled with the changes that have been made to the banjo fittings at the transmission and the camshaft, should do the trick. So this is ready to install, and we'll see how it works and what the numbers are.